Hi, it's Carolyn here. Welcome to the fifth part of the Ray Quilt Along and the final part of the Ray Quilt Along. It's been so fun to sew along with you on this project. In this last video, we will be binding and finishing our quilts. The supplies that we'll need in this video are our quilted quilt. We'll need the binding strips that we cut in the second video. And then we'll also be using the sewing machine and the iron, as well as a pair of scissors. I like using the seam roller again in this one. I'll also be using my walking foot and my CF Handy Guide to check on a few things. I'll be using sewing pins. I'll also be using my small folding table that I'll pull up to my left side to help support the bulk of the quilt as I sew the binding on. The first thing that we'll need to do is to prepare our binding strips. Here's how you do that. To prepare your binding strips, you're going to take your strips one at a time. I'm going to lay the first one face up. I'm going to take the next strip, open it out so that it's one end, and then I lay mine they're right. I mean, this is a solid, so it's two-sided, but if it's a one-sided fabric, you're going to lay them right sides together. And then I align the edges of the selvage up like that. You could draw a diagonal if you'd like, but I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to sew from that end to that end. And I don't need that anymore. And now you can always double check that's correct. And then I'm going to trim like 1/4 inch, like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and press this open with my seam roller. I'll press it at the iron next, but this works great for now. And then I'm going to leave this right side up. So I know this is right side up. And then I'm going to take my strip end, lay it on top like that. Then I'm going to join them together as I did before with that diagonal seam. Trim it with the scissors and then seam roll it. Go through and join all of your binding strips together. Now we'll take it to the ironing board. Now we are going to take our binding, and you can press all of these guys open, but I kind of press them as I come to them. And you're gonna, so this is the wrong side up. So I'm going to fold my binding strips in half, wrong sides together, and then press them with the iron. I'm going to continue to press and fold the entire length of my binding strip, repressing each of those seams open that I joined together, and then pressing the strip in half. And you're going to do this until you have the entire length of your strip pressed in half. Now you have your binding. Next, we're going to add the binding to the quilt. And before we add the binding to the quilt, I want to make one note about squaring up your project. Now is the time to kind of reset the project, make sure it's nice and square so that when we go to sew on the binding, we're sewing it onto a square quilt. Whether you decide to trim off your excess batting and backing to square up your project now, or not, I'm going to do that later. That's definitely a personal preference and it's up to you. For me, I know that my quilt top is relatively square. The quilting didn't distort it or anything like that, so I'm going to go ahead and just machine sew the binding on the front side first, and then I'm going to trim that excess after. Now to add the binding, I'm going to first sew it by machine onto the first side, and then I like tacking it down by hand on the back side. My stitch length is set to about a 2. That's what I like to use when I'm attaching my binding. So I'm going to leave about a 7 or an 8-inch tail at the end of my binding. And then I'm going to put my needle and presser foot down. I'm going to backstitch to lock everything in place. And then I am just going to sew the binding to the front of the quilt. So I'm sewing along the edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance until I get to the corner. Now as I get to the end, you can double check that you want to be a 1/4 inch from this edge right there. So if you wanted to, you could put a pin here, or you can also just eyeball it. Pull out the pin, and then now I'm going to go at a 45-degree angle coming out. Like that. Okay. Now I'm going to fold this so it's at a 45-degree angle to the point, like that. And then you're going to flip it like that. So see, 45, like that. Now I'm going to rotate the project and then put my needle down about a 1/4 inch from the edge. I'm going to backstitch to lock everything in place. And then I'm going to sew along that side. Once you reach to the next corner, I'm going to do the same thing I did before, where I stop about a 1/4 inch before the next side, backstitch a few stitches, and then I'm going to turn off at that corner at a 45-degree angle. Then I'm going to rotate, reposition my binding strip like this. Drop the needle down 1/4 inch from the edge, and then sew along that side. Continue sewing your binding to the quilt top until you get back to where you started. Once I get back to the side that I started on, I'm going to sew until I'm about 7 or 8 inches from that strip end. I'm going to backstitch in place to lock my strip where it is. Now you can see from where I just ended my sewing line, I have about, 8 inches or so. Now I'm going to rotate my quilt and the binding on, I just do it at the bed of my machine, but you could do this on a table too. You just want to be on a flat surface so we can work out the final seam for these binding tails. I'm going to start with the tail that we started with. Since I left the selvage on this tail, I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. Then I'm going to place this tail along the edge of my quilt top. So I'm just going to align it with that raw edge, put it exactly in place where it would need to be if you were sewing it on. Then you want to grab a measuring tool. I've grabbed my CF Handy Guide here. Along the top there are measurements, and I'm going to lay it on top of that strip that I just put in place, because what I'm wanting to do is measure the overlap of these two binding ends. Now I'm going to go back to the other tail that we just ended with. I'm going to lay it on the quilt top along the edge so that it goes over the first tail. I want to cut the ends so that they overlap the same width that I cut my binding. So if you cut your binding 2.5 inches, you'll want to cut your ends so that they overlap 2.5 inches. I cut my binding 2.25 inches, so that's what I'll cut the overlap to be using the measuring guide that I've positioned at the top. I can measure out 2.25 inches and then cut the remaining strip end. Now, this might get a little bit tricky, but you can watch this as many times as you need to make sure that you're getting everything flipped in the right direction. Open out both strip ends and take the beginning strip end, the one that's on the bottom, and layer it right side up with the other strip end right side down like this. Taking a look at the corner, I'm going to look at the 2 points on either side. I'm also going to grab my pins. The seam to sew will be between these 2 points. Make sure your bottom corners are nice and aligned. Pin the layers together. Let's pause for a second. I have a little bit of bad news, and I made a rookie mistake, and I thought I was recording the final segment for this, but it turns out I wasn't. That's a fun surprise, right? Okay, so in place, I grabbed a couple of different scraps, and I'm just going to recreate it here, and hopefully you get the gist. And then I'll put it back on the quilt itself so that you can see the full picture. So I have one end right side down on top of the other end right side up. So what I like to do is to make a little mark where this point is on this side. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from here to here. And you can draw this full line if you'd like. So then what you're going to do needle down, back stitch, okay, so I sewed end to end like that. And so if this were the actual quilt, let's pretend that I did not mess up my filming. Okay. So here we were, joining the 2 ends together. And, okay. So this was this side. This one was this side. And we sewed them end to end. Then you're going to open it up and double check that it fits the space that you need it. This looks great. So then you're going to go ahead and trim so that it's like 1/4 inch. Use your seam roller to press that seam open. And then you're going to fold it back down in place, smooth it out on your quilt, and this is when I like to pin everything back in place. And again, I'm sorry that I didn't do this right. Okay. And now you're going to sew the rest of the seam. So then you go through and stitch everything in place, taking out the pins as you come to them. And what will happen, once you do it correctly, is, ta-da! So this is where I sewed this section, and then ta-da! Now that I've sewn my binding to the front of my project, I'm going to go ahead and trim the batting and the backing from my project. I like to use my long ruler and a rotary cutter, although sometimes I use scissors. It really kind of just depends, I guess, on what I have nearby. Now that my project is trimmed, I'm going to hand stitch the binding onto the back side of my quilt. To hand stitch the binding down, here's what I'm going to use. Need hand sewing needles. I like using the same needles that I use for applique, which are by Clover. I'm going to be using a leather thimble pad as my thimble on my middle finger. These are reusable, so they last for quite a while. I'm going to be using some thread gloss. I've got my yuzu here. It smells really nice. Helps prevent your threads from knotting. I'm going to be using some Clover Wonder Clips. I have a pin cushion to keep my needle. I have thread here. This is 50 weight Aurifil cotton, and I usually like to match my thread to the backing fabric. And since I have a scrappy back, it's mostly all neutral, and this color should work pretty well. I have a small pair of scissors for cutting threads and a thread catcher. So I like starting on an edge. And what you're going to do is bring your fabric around and then clip it. So I have my needle loaded with the thread, and it is knotted on one end. And I'm going to bring the needle up from back here. But I didn't go through the front, so I come up right through the crease. Then I'm grabbing just a few threads of the backing. This is really more of a ladder stitch. So I'm going to work my way along, making the stitches between the binding and the backing fabric, attaching it. And I'll remove the binding clips as I get to them. So I get to the end, I just keep stitching all the way to the kind of the end, and then at the very end, pretty close to the edge, I just make a knot to kind of lock everything in place. And then, now I'm going to turn, and you have, I said flat, I'm going to bring it in so that now you have that nice corner. I'm going to bring my needle up like that. You don't have to do this, I don't know why I do this, just to kind of secure the corner. I do just a little bit of a stitch there, like that. So I've got 2 stitches there, and then now I'm going to go back to stitching it down on this side. And once I get just a few stitches out from that corner, then I'll go ahead and add my Wonder Clips. Then just continue attaching the binding until it is all tacked down. All right, we're all done. Congratulations. I am really excited about my quilt. The quilt is bright and exuberant and happy, which is exactly what I wanted. I love how the different fabrics and colors come together depending on how it's folded or how it's sitting in your lap. The hand quilting makes it cozy and so soft, and I love how it adds an extra layer of colors in the different threads. I also love how the back is a quilt on its own. It's larger pieces and it's scrappy, and they are fabrics that I had in my stash, but I love how they come together and I love how they complement the other side of the quilt. I hope that this project has been fun and enjoyable for you, and I appreciate that you followed along with me. Make sure to subscribe below to stay up to date on any new videos that I publish. And then I'll also put links below for my newsletter, my blog, so that you can stay in touch there too. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.